Welcome back, everybody. We are here. We are talking about Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, as you can see, well marked. We are going to start with what I think is probably the biggest core topic or theme of the book, which is feminism and the feminist perspective. Now, one thing about me, and in years past I wouldn't have had to mention this, but this is 2024, you can't make assumptions about anything. I am not a woman. Never claimed to be. And I think that's an important point. And I don't know why I keep choosing books that are kind of addressing topics that are well outside of my kind of jurisdiction, in a sense, or my personal experience. So I talked a lot about Kindred. A lot about Kindred was about what it means to be kind of a black person in the U.S. with the history of chattel slavery, which, again, I am not personally connected to. I also don't know what it's like to be a woman and live in the world the way a woman does. But I think it is useful to read books like A Room of One's Own, so that people like me, who are men, who generally have it sort of on the easier setting in the game of life, we can kind of get to understand a little bit about what our fellow travelers are going through when they tell us that they are having trouble going through these, because it is very common. You see men on the internet who listen to women who are expressing concern or frustration or anger about the issues that women encounter, and a lot of men can get very petty or very condescending, or they might just give advice which isn't really actionable, because sure, a man could charge into his boss's office and demand a raise, and unfortunately those rules don't work the same for women. But we're off topic, but that's okay, because that's kind of a Woolfian thing. She is discursive, she is stream of consciousness, she'll go off and let thoughts happen, and she will follow them as far as they go until she's interrupted and has to kind of come back to her point. But anyway, the fundamental thesis of the book is that in order to create fiction, a woman must have, for Woolf's, in Woolf's speech, it's 500 pounds a year and a room of her own. Now, 500 pounds a year, it's a little bit tough to translate that into modern money. I found several, honestly, when I tried to run it through a couple of calculators, I found several levels of income, anywhere from about $50,000 to $80,000 US, which for a single person is not a bad salary. And the fictional version of Woolf that she uses in the story talks about how her 500 pounds a year were an inheritance that she got from her dead aunt. Her aunt fell off a horse and left a bequest to our narrator of 500 pounds a year for life. So the narrator doesn't even have to go to work. So imagine that for a moment, if you will, that you get $50,000 to $80,000 put into your bank account, let's say January 1st for the sake of argument, every year for doing nothing, for existing, because your aunt died, and that's it. What would you do with that? Man, what would you do if you just had a free year's income you didn't have to work for? Wow. Anyway, sorry, all right, I got lost in thought for a second there. But yeah, that is her thesis. And what underlies it or what it kind of leads her to, are sort of two avenues of exploration. But the fundamental idea is that you need to be, in order to write fiction, you need to be self-sufficient. You need to have control over your life, and the control that money gives you, and the control that having a place of your own where people can't interrupt you gives you control over your own life. And then the next kind of question was, well, why haven't women had that? Why haven't women been able to have this level of control over their lives, over human history? And she does a lot of reading about that. She does a lot of reading about women going back to, the Elizabethan era, for example. One of the tasks that she sets herself is trying to find out something about the Elizabethan era and about normal women. What do women do during the day, during this time? And she can't find anything, because women aren't writing about themselves, and men certainly aren't writing about the daily lives of women. At one point in the early narrative, she goes to two luncheons. One of them is at the fictional Oxbridge, of course, a combination of Oxford and Cambridge, where they have a lovely luncheon of delicious food and wonderful wine, and they all chat for a while and enjoy each other's company. And she talks about how, the whole atmosphere lights the warm flame of rational intercourse that is the kind of environment where you can sit down with people and come up with ideas that may eventually lead to books. And Oxbridge, of course, is largely a men's college, right? She sets that up pretty quickly by talking about how in several instances she is blocked from going into a library or going into a different hall because she is not a man. So the men at Oxbridge get this delicious food and this wonderful environment to come up with these lovely ideas that they have. And then she goes to Fernham College across the way, which is a women's college. Do they have luxurious food and delicious wines? No, they have beef and vegetables. They have a gravy soup on plain plates. They drink water. And when dinner is up, everybody kind of just gets up and leaves, right? They don't have that. So it leads to, if that is the environment that women are learning in, then maybe they're not writing because they don't have that level of comfort. They don't have that level of relaxation that will allow their minds to kind of come up with the ideas that they need in order to write poetry and fiction and novels and such. And that leads, of course, to the next question of, well, why not? Why didn't the founders of Fernham College pour as much money into their college as the founders of Oxbridge did? Why aren't the foundations laid in silver and gold? Why don't they have the money to eat delicious pheasant and sole in a cream sauce and all of that good stuff? And the answer is because they were busy raising children, because they were busy taking care of a house. They were busy doing all of the things that women have always done and never really gotten the recognition or, of course, the pay for. And so there's a wonderfully little sarcastic passage where Woolf kind of takes that to task. Okay, so I'm going to read from the book here. Woolf says, at the thought of all those women working year after year and finding it hard to get £2,000 together, and as much as they could do to get £30,000, we burst out at scorn in the reprehensible poverty of our sex. What had our mothers been doing then that they had no wealth to leave us? Powdering their noses? Looking in at shop windows? Flaunting in the sun at Monte Carlo? There were some photographs on the mantelpiece. Mary's mother, if that was her picture, may have been a wastrel in her spare time. She had 13 children by a minister of the church. But if her gay and dissipated life had left too few traces on the pleasures of her face, she was a homely body, an old lady in a plaid shawl, which was fastened by a large cameo. She sat in a basket chair, encouraging a spaniel to look at the camera with the amused yet strained expression of one who is sure the dog will move directly the bulb is pressed, which, by the way, I kind of find funny that even in 1928, people are A, still trying to take cute pictures of their pets, and B, their pets aren't having it. Some things do not change. Anyway, I continue. She says, now, if she had gone into business, had become a manufacturer of artificial silk or a magnate on the stock exchange, if she had left £200,000 or £300,000 to Fernham, we could have been sitting at our ease tonight, and the subject of our talk might have been archaeology, botany, anthropology, physics, the nature of the atom, mathematics, astronomy, relativity, geography. If only Mrs. Seton and her mother before her, had learned the great art of making money and had left their money, like their fathers and their grandfathers before them, to found fellowships and lectureships and prizes and scholarships appropriated to the use of their own sex, we might have dined very tolerably here tonight off a bird and a bottle of wine. We might have looked forward without undue confidence to a pleasant and honorable lifetime spent in the shelter of one of the liberally endowed professions. We might have been exploring or writing, mooning about the venerable places of the earth, sitting contemplative on the steps of the Parthenon, or going at 10 to an office and coming home comfortably at 4:30 to write a little poetry. Only if Mrs. Seton and her like had gone into business at the age of 15, there would have been, it was a snag in the argument, no Mary. So, in that passage, Woolf is saying, why didn't these women go into business? Why didn't they found companies and directorships and leave that money to their grandchildren? And the answer, of course, is they couldn't. They had no control over their own money. They never did. And even if they did, they didn't have the time because they were expected to do all the things that women were expected to do. And so Woolf, throughout the book, tries to understand this. She tries to understand how women, not just how women didn't have control over their own lives. That's pretty much a fairly straightforward point that we get to fairly early in the book. But how did women write despite this? When we get to like Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte and a bunch of other wonderful writers and poets who did manage, it's not like women writers just sort of popped into existence in the early, the late 1800s. Women did manage to write. So how did they do it? We talk about women who wrote and had to hide their manuscripts for fear that they would be found out and thrown out the door. She talks about women who had to, whose writing took forever because they're consistently being interrupted by children and by men and by other things. And this burning need to write is really important, but it is held back by simply the social nature that women have to live in throughout time. And Woolf really wants to put forward to her audience, which again is a group of women at women's college, that this is one thing that we have to change. If women are going to become writers, if they're going to become anything, really, if they're going to succeed in the things they want to succeed in, they have to have the liberty to explore those things. They have to have the freedom in their lives to explore those things. And of course, where does that freedom come from? Which is an excellent question, which is economic, which is the subject of another video, which will be coming a little bit later. Another avenue of exploration that Woolf looked at in terms of sort of the feminist perspective in all of this was women as subjects of fiction. And she points to how men, there's a wonderful passage where she goes to the British Library or the British Museum, and she is looking for information about women in fiction. And she realizes that so many men have written so many books about women. She says, are you aware that you are one of the most studied creatures in the universe? And she looks at all these different books by all these different men about all these different women and realizes that it's strange that women don't write books about men, but men are constantly trying to figure women out. Men are constantly writing about women in the most minute and peculiar situations and senses. And Woolf finds that really, really fascinating, especially not just in terms of the nonfiction that's written about women, but also the fiction that's written about women. The idea that women in real life, when writers would write about real women, and they would say awful things about real women, say that women are by and large basically, just drones. They were soulless. Some people said soulless. They were, the best woman is in no way better than the worst man. We had lines like that. And so a lot of these writers would portray real women as these just drudges if they portrayed them at all. But there's all these fictional women, right? Clytemnestra and Antigone. We've got Cleopatra. We have Madame Bovary. We have all these fictional women who are amazing. They are full and real characters. And so the question then becomes, why are these fictional women so fascinating and powerful and interesting, and the real women just such drudges, right? That's a question that she's trying to figure out. And one of, if I may kind of discourse a little bit, sure, discourse, why not? If I may discourse a little bit, Woolf has set herself kind of an impossible task, as she points out, that her research question is just women in fiction. And if I may give some advice to some of you who are students, as I've said before, I am a teacher. If you are going to be doing research into something, I strongly recommend that you make your research question as specific as possible, right? So otherwise, you're going to get overwhelmed, the way our narrator does in this book, with tons and tons of information that now you have to sift through to figure out what you're trying to say. Of course, Woolf chose the opposite. She has a big piece of paper on the table that says women in fiction along the top of it, and she tries to figure it out for herself. That's her style. It worked for her. She's a brilliant writer. I'm not really going to critique that, but not all of us are Virginia Woolf. But anyway, her examination throughout the book does try to examine why women live the way they do, why women are portrayed the way that they are in fiction and in literature, and why it is that women seem to make men so angry in a lot of ways, especially when women kind of move out of the role that they have been assigned. There's one really neat metaphor that she uses of women as an enlarging mirror. She says that women throughout history have been used so that men will feel bigger. Men will feel more powerful or more important than they really are. And it is that idea that men do things to impress women, which is certainly true. Men do things to impress women. And what happens then when women decide to stop doing that? When a woman says, no, you know what? I don't want to exist as a mirror for you. I want to exist in my own right as a human being. Well, that makes men angry because now they don't have somebody to tell them how awesome they are, how handsome they are, how cool they are, how powerful they are. And they are forced to then wrestle with their own existence. And a lot of men can't really deal with that. And we still see this today. We still see powerful women, very accomplished women, who make men real mad because they're powerful and accomplished, and then whatever it is that they do, because men have decided they're angry at these women who have decided not to reflect men, everything these women do make men mad. We can look at Taylor Swift going to football games, and you see occasionally on Twitter men going, "Oh, the NFL is ruined now because Taylor Swift is here having a good time." And I suspect it's just they don't like Taylor Swift because Taylor Swift is enormously successful and business savvy and knows what she's doing. So yeah, we do still see that men have a certain resentment about women who have broken the mold, who have decided that they want to exist on their own terms. And there is a definite section of the male population that doesn't like that. They don't want that. And that gets back to the whole kind of, there's a resurgence of men who kind of just want women to go back into their traditional roles. If we look at Roe versus Wade and abortion rights in the US, we still see that. And that kind of leaks over into kind of trans issues as well. That, there's just a whole bunch of people who don't want folks running their own lives and really don't want folks making their own choices about their lives. They get very angry about that for some reason. So yeah, this is as a piece of feminist literature of the 20th century. This is fairly foundational. And as I said before, I'm not an expert in Woolf. I'm not really an expert in feminism, if we're going to be honest. I think I know enough to sound like I know what I'm talking about, but anybody who really knows what they're talking about knows that I don't know what I'm talking about. And at least I know that I don't know what I'm talking about, which makes me special? I don't know. Special for YouTube, perhaps. But I find it really interesting. There have been some critiques of Woolf in later years, especially, again, as our sort of social and cultural understandings have advanced. One of the things that Woolf seems to gloss over is a class issue. She talks about getting 500 pounds a year. And her fictional avatar in the book got it as an inheritance, right? Her aunt dies in a horseback riding accident, and now the narrator just gets 500 pounds a year, once a year, every year for life, for nothing. And that's it. You know, she mentions about how impressed she is that her purse just produces money out of nowhere. Most women can't have that. Most women, even if they're going to have 500 pounds a year, they are working for 500 pounds a year. They have a job, they have employment. And that often, as all of us with jobs and a creative impulse know, a job and creativity are not always really useful to each other, except insofar as the job provides you with the money to live and eat and survive. And so I think Woolf's statement that a woman needs 500 pounds a year in a room of her own, certainly true. However, there are class implications that I think she's overlooking or has decided not to talk about for one reason or another. And it does raise the question of, what about women who want to make art but don't have that kind of liberty of time? And she does kind of address that at the end, and she brings to mind, she brings up a quote from a scholar of literature who basically points out that even among men, if you look at men poets and playwrights and authors, most of them tend to be wealthy, which kind of then puts a whole new spin on her overall point, which is not maybe an issue of feminism at all. Maybe it's an issue of economic inequality, or it is, as we say today in the 21st century, intersectional, right? Feminism and economic inequality, they intersect with each other. So even the least economically well-off man is still better off in terms of being able to create art than an economically advantaged woman. So there's that. There is no sort of intersection here between feminism and race. That is not something that Woolf brings up. It is something that I think later writers probably tried to kind of square that circle. Like, what happens when you introduce race and racism into this mix? Is there anything else that is necessary? Because we've seen from research and studies and even simply just anecdotal discussions that it is hard to be a woman in many countries. I know this is not always applicable for every country ever, but it's harder to be a woman than to be a man, and it's harder to be a woman of color than it is to be a white woman. And so Woolf doesn't address that. That's not part of her argument at all. It would be really interesting to see if maybe I should just read more of her works and see if at any point she ever dips a toe into that. I don't know. But probably what will happen is future scholars pick that up. I'm sure other people who have studied Woolf and made Woolf into their careers probably started taking her idea and saying, all right, this is a good idea, 500 pounds a year in a room of your own. Now let's look at it through sort of a more intersectional framework. So, there is a lot, and honestly, I've been talking for about 20 minutes here. I am absolutely certain that I have left something out or forgotten something or just ignored something, and there's something that's not in my notes that should have been in my notes, because I'm a guy who likes books and I like to talk about them. So if you have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear those. I would love to hear what I've missed, and I think we can start a discussion about this. One of the beautiful things about the book is that it is, unfortunately, in some ways, it is sort of timeless. The issues that Woolf is raising are issues that we're still facing today. And so I think it is worth it to read the book if you haven't already, if you're interested in these kinds of issues. And if you have read the book and you have maybe taken up her torch and taken up her ideas and chased them into the future, I would love to hear from that as well. But in the meantime, thank you all very much for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.